I never thought the person who was supposed to love me the most, the one who promised to stand by me through everything, would be the one to make me feel so small in my own home. Marriage, I used to believe, was about partnership, respect, and building a life together. And for a while, that is exactly what it felt like. In the early years, my husband and I were a team. We worked hard, we laughed often, and we promised each other that no matter what happened, we would never forget to cherish the little things. But time has a strange way of changing people, or maybe it just reveals who they really are. Somewhere along the way, the laughter faded and the promises grew dim, and the person I thought would be my greatest supporter turned into my harshest critic. It began with small comments, subtle remarks I brushed off because I thought he was joking. "Maybe a little too much salt this time," he would say, smirking as he pushed his plate away. Or, "My mom never burned rice the way you do." At first I laughed with him, even teased myself because that was easier than letting the sting sink in. I told myself it didn't matter, that cooking was just a task, not a measure of my worth. But the comments didn't stop. They grew sharper, louder, harder to ignore. Every meal became a test I seemed destined to fail. I would spend hours trying new recipes, searching online, calling my sister for tips, even sneaking into cooking classes during lunch breaks at work. I wanted so badly to make something he would enjoy, something that would make him smile and remind us of the days when love was easy. But no matter what I did, his response was always the same. A smirk, a laugh, a dismissive shake of the head. "Not bad, but my mom makes it better. Why can't you follow a recipe like normal people? I don't know how you can mess up something this simple." Each word chipped away at me until I no longer looked forward to dinner. Instead of feeling proud to serve my family, I felt dread, as though every meal was a stage and I was destined to fail before the curtain even rose. And all of this might have been easier to endure if it were just between him and me. But it wasn't. He made those comments in front of our daughter, our little girl, barely 7 years old, sitting at the table with wide eyes as she listened to the man she adored mocking the woman she loved most. At first she didn't react. She just ate quietly, pretending not to notice. But I noticed. I noticed how her smile would fade when he laughed. I noticed how her tiny shoulders stiffened when I lowered my head in embarrassment. She was learning something dangerous at that table, that it was normal to belittle someone, that love meant criticism instead of kindness. And the thought of her growing up believing that terrified me. One night, after yet another round of his jokes, I sat alone in the kitchen long after they had gone to bed. The dishes were cold, the food untouched, and my hands trembled as I washed the plates. I felt invisible, unappreciated, like no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. My mind replayed his laughter over and over until it echoed louder than my own heartbeat. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand respect. But instead I stayed silent because silence was easier than another fight. And in that silence, a seed of doubt grew inside me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I wasn't the wife he needed. That thought haunted me more than any insult ever could. But what I didn't realize in that moment, as I stood in the quiet kitchen drowning in self-doubt, was that someone else had been watching. Someone who saw more than I thought she did. Someone who, despite her small size, carried a voice more powerful than either of us could imagine. Because soon, my daughter, with just 5 words, would remind us both what love really meant. And those 5 words would change everything. The nights blurred together, one dinner after another, and with each passing day, the laughter at my expense grew louder while my own voice grew smaller. I told myself over and over that it was just words, that I was strong enough to ignore them. But the truth was, every comment left a scar I couldn't see, but could always feel. Cooking had once been my way of showing love. I would chop vegetables carefully, season the broth with patience, stir the pot slowly while humming little songs under my breath. It wasn't just food to me. It was my way of telling my family that they mattered, that I cared enough to create something with my hands and my heart. But to him, it became a running joke, a nightly routine of mockery dressed as humor. He would lift the lid off the pot, sniff dramatically, and say, "Well, let's see if we survive this one." He would take a bite, chew slowly with an exaggerated face, then declare to our daughter, "Sweetie, if you want to eat real food someday, I'll take you to Grandma's house. Your mom just can't quite get it right." He laughed at his own words, but I could feel my daughter's eyes on me, wide and uncertain, as if she didn't know whether she should laugh with him or stay silent. She usually chose silence, picking at her food, pushing it around her plate, her little brows furrowed in confusion. And that silence hurt more than his words, because silence meant she was learning. She was absorbing every second, and I feared the lesson she was taking away. I began to dread dinner time. I tried harder, stayed up late searching recipes, woke up early to marinate dishes, poured everything into making something that would finally earn a smile instead of a smirk. But no matter how much effort I put in, the outcome was always the same. His jokes grew crueler, his comparisons harsher, until one night he actually pushed his plate away and said, "You know what? Maybe you should just stop cooking altogether. You're wasting food and time. We'd all be better off ordering takeout." My face burned, my throat tightened, but I swallowed the lump in my chest because crying in front of him felt like giving him power. I excused myself, walked into the kitchen, and stood by the sink with my back turned, gripping the counter so tightly my knuckles went white. Behind me, I could hear him chuckling at his own joke, and then, in the quiet that followed, I heard the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl. My daughter was eating quietly, not saying a word, but I knew she felt it all. Later that night, when I tucked her into bed, she looked at me with those big, innocent eyes and asked in a small voice, "Mommy, why does Daddy always laugh at your food?" I froze. My throat went dry, my hands shook as I smoothed her blanket. How could I explain cruelty to a child? How could I make her understand that sometimes the people we love the most can also be the ones who hurt us the deepest? I forced a smile, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Because sometimes people forget that effort matters more than perfection. Don't ever forget that, sweetheart." She nodded softly, but I could see the questions still swirling in her mind, questions I didn't have the strength to answer. That night, I lay awake again, staring into the darkness, wondering how my marriage had turned into this battlefield where respect was the first casualty. I thought about leaving. I thought about what life would look like without his constant criticism. But then I thought of my daughter, of how much she adored her father despite his flaws, and I told myself I had to endure it, at least for her sake. But enduring came at a cost. With every dinner, every laugh, every careless comment, I felt pieces of myself slipping away. The confident woman I once was seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who second-guessed everything, who apologized even when she wasn't wrong, who measured her worth by the tilt of her husband's smile. And through it all, my daughter watched. She never said much, but her eyes said everything. They held confusion, sadness, and sometimes even disappointment, not in me, but in the way her father treated me. She was too young to put it into words, but I knew she was learning about love, about respect, about marriage, from what she saw at that table. And that terrified me more than anything, because I didn't want her to grow up believing this was normal. I didn't want her to think love meant belittling, or that effort didn't deserve respect. I wanted her to know better. I wanted her to grow up stronger than me. What I didn't realize then was that she already was. She was stronger, braver, and wiser than I could see. And soon, in the simplest way, with the simplest words, she would prove it. The weeks dragged on, and dinner became a stage I dreaded stepping onto. Every night I carried plates to the table with trembling hands, not because of the heat, but because I already knew what was coming. My husband sat down with that familiar look of expectation, fork in hand, ready to judge. I set the food down, forcing a smile, and sat across from him while my daughter sat quietly between us. He would take a bite, pause dramatically, and let out a laugh. "Well, at least it's edible this time," he'd say, or, "Sweetheart, you really should take notes from Grandma. This is nowhere close." His voice carried a mix of humor and cruelty, and I could never tell if he realized how deeply it cut. Sometimes he added a smirk, sometimes he rolled his eyes, but every time it chipped away at me a little more. I tried not to react. I told myself if I stayed calm, if I didn't show my hurt, maybe he would stop. But he didn't. Instead, my silence seemed to fuel him. He laughed louder, spoke harsher, and every meal became another wound. And through it all, my daughter sat quietly, spoon in hand, eating in silence. At first, I thought her silence meant she didn't understand, that maybe she was too young to realize the cruelty wrapped in his jokes. But then I began to notice the way she looked at me. Her eyes followed every flinch, every forced smile, every quick glance I cast down at my plate. She saw everything. One evening, I tried a new recipe, something I had worked on all afternoon. It was a stew with herbs I had never used before, a dish I hoped would finally earn at least one kind word. As I set the bowls on the table, my husband sniffed the air and chuckled. "Let's see what experiment we have tonight." I ignored him, sat down, and focused on my daughter, gently reminding her to eat slowly. He took a spoonful, chewed dramatically, then sighed. "You know what? Maybe cooking just isn't for you. You're not cut out for this. Honestly, it's embarrassing." My chest tightened, my cheeks burned, but before I could say anything, I noticed movement beside me. My daughter had put her spoon down. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, staring at her bowl, her little hands resting still on the table. The silence was heavy, thicker than any words he had spoken. For a moment, even he seemed to notice. He looked at her, waiting for her to laugh with him, to join in. But she didn't. She just sat there, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the food. And then, without a word, she picked up her spoon again and continued eating slowly, never glancing at him, never smiling. That silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. It was as if she was refusing to play his game. I felt a strange mix of pain and pride in that moment. Pain, because she had to sit through this. Pride, because she was showing more strength than I ever could. But the tension didn't end there. The days that followed carried the same routine. His jokes, my silence, her watchful eyes. And each time her silence grew heavier. It was no longer the silence of confusion but of choice. She was choosing not to laugh, choosing not to join in, choosing to resist in her own quiet way. And I began to realize something. She wasn't just watching me. She was waiting for the moment to speak, waiting for the right words. She was carrying something inside her, and I didn't know when it would come out. But I knew when it did, it would matter. Because she wasn't a little girl anymore, not in the way she saw the world. She understood more than I gave her credit for, and the quiet strength in her eyes told me she had already made up her mind. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. She didn't ask me why he mocked me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply said, "Mommy, I see everything." My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned over and closed her eyes, leaving me with her words echoing in my mind. That night, I lay awake wondering what she had seen, what she had understood, and what she planned to do with it. Because deep down, I knew she was no longer just a bystander. She was waiting for her moment, and when that moment came, it would change everything. The night it happened began like so many others, with me carrying dishes to the table and setting them down carefully, hoping that maybe this time things would be different. I had spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen, chopping, stirring, tasting, praying for just one moment of peace, just one meal without a joke at my expense. My daughter sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching me with those wide eyes that always seemed to see more than I wanted her to. My husband sat back in his chair, phone in hand, glancing at me with that look of amused expectation I had come to dread. I placed his plate in front of him, forced a smile, and sat down. He picked up his fork, twirled it between his fingers, and took his first bite. For a split second I held my breath, hoping, but then it came, like it always did. He chewed slowly, raised his brows, and smirked. "Wow," he said loudly, "another masterpiece. If your goal was to ruin pasta, you nailed it." He chuckled at his own words, leaned back in his chair, and glanced at our daughter, waiting for her to laugh with him. My stomach knotted, my hands trembled under the table, and I lowered my gaze to my plate, pretending not to hear. The silence stretched on, broken only by his laughter, but this time something was different. My daughter's spoon clinked softly against her bowl as she set it down. She looked up, not at me, but straight at him. Her small voice, steady but firm, cut through the room. "But Daddy," she tries. 5 words. Just 5 simple words. And in that instant, everything stopped. His smile faded, his laughter died in his throat, and he stared at her as if he had never seen her before. The room went still. I froze, my fork hovering above my plate, my heart pounding in my chest. My daughter didn't look away. Her eyes, so young yet so full of truth, held his without fear. "But Daddy," she tries. The words echoed in the silence, heavier than any insult he had ever thrown at me. They carried all the love, all the defense, all the strength I thought she didn't have, and they cut deeper than anything I could have said myself. My husband opened his mouth as if to reply, but no words came. His face flushed red, his eyes darted away, and for once he had nothing to say. He looked down at his plate, his fork still in his hand, but he didn't take another bite. He just sat there, quiet, stunned. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from something else. Relief, pride, a bittersweet ache in my chest. My little girl, my quiet observer, had spoken for me in a way I never could. She had defended me with words so pure, so simple, they stripped away every excuse, every defense he might have had. I reached over and gently touched her hand, my voice shaking as I whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart." She glanced at me and gave the faintest smile before returning to her meal, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But it had. Everything had changed in those 5 words. My husband sat in silence for the rest of the meal. No jokes, no laughter, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when someone has been forced to see themselves clearly for the first time. When the table was cleared and dishes washed, he lingered in the kitchen, unusually still, watching me as I moved about. He opened his mouth once, twice, as though searching for something to say, but in the end, he just lowered his gaze and left the room. I knew then that those 5 words had reached him in a way my years of silence never could. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope, not just for me, but for us, for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he would finally understand the weight of his words. The house felt different after that night, as if those 5 words spoken by my daughter had shifted something in the very air we breathed. My husband, once so quick with his laughter and his biting remarks, was strangely quiet. He moved through the rooms as though deep in thought, his eyes avoiding mine, yet lingering just long enough for me to see the guilt behind them. For the first time in years, dinner was silent, not because of shame, but because there were no cruel words left to fill the space. He ate quietly, glanced at our daughter, glanced at me, and though he said nothing, I could feel the weight of those 5 words pressing on him. "But Daddy, she tries." It echoed in his silence, and I could tell he was hearing it over and over, just as I was. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes, subtle at first, almost hesitant. One morning, instead of leaving his empty coffee mug on the counter, he rinsed it and placed it gently in the sink. Another evening, as I stirred a pot on the stove, he walked into the kitchen, paused for a moment, and quietly asked, "Need any help?" I nearly dropped the spoon. For years, those words had never left his lips. I looked at him, unsure if he meant it, but he took the knife from the counter and began chopping the vegetables awkwardly, too thick, too uneven, but with a concentration that felt unfamiliar yet sincere. I said nothing, just let him stand there beside me, and for the first time in so long, the kitchen felt less like a battlefield and more like a home. Slowly, the changes grew. He stopped making jokes about the food. He started thanking me instead, sometimes with words, sometimes with just a quiet nod and a soft smile. And though his praise was clumsy, almost unsure, it carried a sincerity I had long forgotten he was capable of. One night, as our daughter finished her meal, he looked at her and said softly, "Your mom works hard to make this for us. We should be grateful." My eyes widened, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. It was as if those words came from a stranger, yet they were exactly the words I had been aching to hear. My daughter nodded, her small smile filled with pride, and in that moment I realized she had been the one to teach him, not me. Because while I had endured in silence, she had spoken with truth. 5 words, that was all it took. One evening, after putting our daughter to bed, I found him sitting at the kitchen table alone, staring at his hands. I walked in quietly, unsure if I should disturb his thoughts, but before I could speak, he looked up at me. His eyes were tired, softer than I remembered, and his voice cracked as he said, "I'm sorry." Just 2 words, but they carried years of regret. He shook his head, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't realize how cruel I was being. I thought I was being funny. I thought it didn't matter. But hearing her say that, hearing her defend you, it broke something in me. I never want her to think it's okay to treat someone like that, and I never should have treated you that way. I stood frozen, my heart aching with a mixture of anger, relief, and something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to change. I want to be better, for you, for her. For the first time in years, I saw the man I had married, the one who had promised to cherish me, the one who had held my hand through hard times, the one I thought I had lost. Tears blurred my vision as I placed my hand in his, not as forgiveness, but as a fragile step toward rebuilding what we had broken. Our daughter, without knowing it, had given us both a second chance. From that night on, things were different. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Meals became moments of quiet gratitude instead of tension. The kitchen, once filled with laughter at my expense, now carried the soft hum of teamwork, of shared effort. And my daughter, my brave little girl, grew up knowing the truth I had once been afraid she would miss. That love is not about perfection, it's about respect. Looking back now, I realize those 5 words did more than silence cruelty. They became a mirror, forcing him to see himself not through his own eyes, but through the eyes of the child who adored him. And in that reflection, he found the strength to change. I used to think my voice didn't matter, that silence was easier than fighting, but my daughter taught me something different. She taught me that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truths. She reminded me that effort, no matter how imperfect, is worth respect. And she proved to me that love, real love, isn't measured in flawless meals or grand gestures. It's measured in kindness, in effort, in the willingness to try. And so, whenever I stand in the kitchen now, chopping, stirring, cooking with love, I no longer hear the echoes of cruel laughter. I hear her voice steady and clear. But Daddy, she tries. And I know that those words didn't just change him. They changed me. They changed us forever.